Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Caldwell called her when she passed him in the corridor 3 months ago, his voice dripping with a kind of dismissal reserved for people who didn't matter. Margaret Walsh hadn't corrected him. She'd simply nodded and kept walking, her badge clipped to scrubs that had faded from repeated washing, her shoes silent on the linoleum. He had no idea who he was speaking to. He had no idea that the woman who restocked medication carts at 2 in the morning had held a fractured spine upright for 11 hours while insurgents hammered a perimeter. He didn't know that her hands, steady, precise, unmarked by tremor, had performed emergency cricothyrotomy in a desert clinic with nothing but a ballpoint pen and a prayer. What happened next would prove that the quietest person in the hospital was the most dangerous. The night shift at Sacred Heart in Raleigh belongs to ghosts. Margaret understood this 3 years into her tenure, moving through fluorescent corridors at 0200 hours like she'd been designed for the dark. The antiseptic smell hung thick in the ICU, bleach and something chemical underneath, the smell of things being killed. Her footsteps made no sound. She'd learned that skill a long time ago, in places where sound meant death. The other nurses on night rotation had stopped trying to include her in break room conversations by month 2. She didn't volunteer personal information. She didn't ask about their children. She moved through Sacred Heart's 12 floors like a woman who'd been trained to be invisible, and invisibility was exactly what she needed. 3 years. 795 shifts. 0 disciplinary notes. 0 complaints. Margaret had built a wall of competence so high and so quiet that the hospital's entire nursing staff had simply accepted that she existed as a function rather than a person. The charge nurse didn't need to ask her to take the difficult patients, she simply assigned them. Margaret accepted without comment. She worked double shifts without overtime pay listed correctly. She trained new staff on procedures and let them take credit. This wasn't self-sacrifice. It was survival. Somewhere in a Pentagon filing system, a service record had been sealed. Somewhere in a classified database, Major Margaret Walsh was listed as KIA in a training accident, the official story maintained with a kind of finality that made it dangerous to surface. She pulled her jacket tighter as she moved through the medication room, checking stock with the methodical precision of someone who'd inventoried more than supplies. The faded patch sewn inside her jacket lining, 3rd Special Forces Group, barely visible even to her own eyes when she changed clothes, pressed against her ribs like a ghost. Like evidence. Like a liability. The jacket had to stay inside the locker except for the walk to and from the parking lot. The patch had to stay hidden. The woman who'd held Bagram airfield for 11 hours couldn't exist in a hospital where the most important thing was being forgotten. The intercom crackled at 0247. Code Grey, ICU. Margaret didn't move until the charge nurse appeared at the medication cart, her face pale. "We need you upstairs. We need AB negative blood donor. Critical patient, ICU room for 12. You're the only match on night shift." Margaret's hand stilled over the 5 milligram vials of morphine she'd been organizing. AB negative. That rarity that made her blood worth something in a city where she'd become invisible. "Go," the charge nurse said. "I'll cover your floor." The elevator rose with the kind of mechanical groan that made Margaret think of helicopter blades cutting through Afghan air. 5th floor. The door slid open and the smell changed, sharper, more urgent. The ICU smells like fear and antiseptic and the faint copper of blood beneath the bleach. A nurse she didn't recognize waved her toward room for 12. "Quick turnaround if possible. We're running low." Margaret nodded and pushed through the double doors. She froze 3 steps from the bed. Colonel Marcus Haines lay motionless beneath a white sheet, his right arm wrapped in gauze that had yellowed at the edges. Tubes ran from his nose. The ventilator beside him wheezed its mechanical rhythm like something alive and suffering. She knew that face. Not from a casual meeting. Not from a briefing with 100 other faces in the room. She knew it from the closed hearing 7 years ago, a windowless room at Bagram where he'd read the charges against her with his jaw clenched tight and his eyes never meeting hers. She knew it from the moment his voice had delivered the verdict that would erase her. Margaret didn't move. She didn't breathe visibly. The trembling wasn't fear, the trembling was restraint, the kind of restraint that comes from 7 years of being dead and still somehow walking around. She forced her hand to move. For access. She needed to establish peripheral access for the blood draw, and her hands were already reaching for the tourniquet before her mind caught up. Muscle memory took over. The vein in his left antecubital fossa stood out, dark blue against weathered skin. She'd seen that vein before, seen the same forearm extended across a table for blood draws during medical certifications she'd completed in another life. A 20-gauge needle slid into the vein with the kind of precision that came from having done this 10,000 times. The flash chamber filled with dark red. Sinus rhythm on the monitor above him, steady, reliable, the only thing about him that still functioned. Margaret withdrew the needle and taped the catheter in place with movements that betrayed nothing. Her hands moved like they'd been trained to move. Perfectly. Precisely. Lethally. The kind of precision that comes from having worked under fire. "Thank you," the charge nurse said. Margaret nodded, her voice level. "Drawing now." She filled the collection tubes in the correct order, EDTA first, then the serum separator, then the citrate. The blood came dark and rich, the kind of blood that was rare and valuable and worth keeping even from a man like Haines. She didn't look at his face again. She couldn't. 7 years of discipline wouldn't survive another second of looking at the man who destroyed her career with a sentence read in a room with no windows. 2 minutes. That's how long the blood draw took. By the time Margaret handed the tubes to the waiting tech, Dr. Caldwell had moved into position by the desk, his eyes tracking her with the kind of focus that made her spine straighten. She didn't acknowledge him. She simply logged out of the system and turned toward the door. But she didn't leave immediately. Instead, she paused at Haines's bedside to check the 4 lines she'd placed, a legitimate clinical action, the kind any nurse might perform. Her eyes, however, had shifted to the monitor beside him. The restricted files folder sat on the desk directly behind her, the kind of classified documentation that shouldn't be in an open ICU and especially shouldn't be visible to the night shift staff. Margaret saw the treatment codes at the edge of her vision. SAPS TKA47. JTAG redacted. And underneath, barely visible, the letterhead marker, Bagram classified operation file. Her hands froze over the 4 tubing. The codes connected. She understood immediately. Those weren't normal post-operative notes. Those were classified treatment protocols, the kind of documentation that only existed in closed operations and sealed hearings. The kind of documentation that explained why Colonel Haines had been brought to a civilian hospital in Raleigh instead of Walter Reed. The kind of documentation that connected directly to the operation that had been buried so thoroughly that even she'd stopped looking for evidence it had existed. Caldwell watched from the corner. Margaret could feel his attention like a weight. She straightened the 4 line, a normal adjustment, 3 seconds of clinical work, and when she turned toward the door, her face was blank. Neutral. The face of a nurse who'd simply done her job and didn't know anything about classified files or buried operations or the man in the bed who'd signed the paperwork to make her disappear. What they didn't know was that Margaret had just confirmed everything. The walk back to the elevator took 18 seconds. Her heart rate remained steady. Her breathing remained controlled. She'd survived 7 years by being invisible, and invisibility required perfect composure. It required never letting anyone see the truth that lived behind her eyes, that she remembered every detail of the hearing, every word Haines had spoken, every way the military had decided that her testimony was a liability instead of a truth. It required knowing that the man in room for 12 was connected to the operation they'd buried, which meant the Pentagon had somehow gotten him to a hospital where she worked, which meant her presence here was either the worst coincidence in her life or the setup for something worse. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric song as the elevator doors closed. Margaret caught her reflection in the polished steel, pale, steady, utterly unremarkable. Just a nurse. Just a woman who worked nights and didn't ask questions and kept her head down and bled AB negative and remembered everything. The next voice she heard would change everything. Monday morning came with rain hammering the Sacred Heart parking lot like distant artillery. Margaret had been standing at Colonel Haines's bedside for exactly 90 seconds when Dr. Caldwell's shadow fell across the threshold of room for 12. He moved with the deliberate slowness of a man who enjoyed the moment before impact, polished shoes clicking against tile, white coat perfectly pressed, the kind of sartorial precision that came from knowing every mirror in a hospital corridor reflected your authority back at you. Behind him, Amanda Haines turned from her father's bedside, her Navy lieutenant's dress uniform crisp as fresh paper. "Nurse Walsh." Caldwell's voice carried the casual cruelty of a man accustomed to being obeyed without explanation. "Your loitering around restricted patients is disturbing to families. This man is a decorated colonel. He doesn't need some night shift nobody hovering over his bedside like you're entitled to his medical history." The words landed precisely where he'd aimed them, loud enough for the hallway to hear, low enough to feel personal. Margaret's hands remained steady at her sides. She'd trained for interrogation, for broken ribs and chemical burns, for holding intestines inside a soldier's abdomen with nothing but an MRE wrapper and determination. She could hold steady for this. Amanda Haines turned away uncomfortably, suddenly very interested in the ventilator settings on the wall monitor. In that moment of deliberate maternal distance, Margaret understood the daughter had already decided the night shift nurse was nobody worth defending. Margaret took one measured breath through her nose. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their monotonous frequency, 240 Hz, the sound of a hospital's nervous system exposed. She looked directly at Caldwell, held his gaze without flinching, and felt the tear come. Not from fear. Not from shame. But from the sheer weight of carrying a secret large enough to bury a person alive. A single tear escaped her left eye and traced down her cheek, and she wiped it with the back of her hand, her movements precise as a sniper's trigger control, without breaking eye contact for a single moment. "Understood, Doctor," she said quietly. The words came out soft as winter rain. Not apologetic. Not deferential. Just factual. Just a woman acknowledging the terrain she stood on and calculating the next 3 moves. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He'd expected either tears or defiance, and instead he'd gotten something far more unsettling: composure. He'd tried to break her and the glass hadn't even cracked. He turned on his heel and walked back down the hallway, Amanda trailing behind him, both of them already looking past the night shift nurse as though she was part of the furniture. Margaret stood alone at Colonel Marcus Haines's bedside for another 30 seconds. His chest rose and fell with mechanical regularity. His hands lay above the blankets, weathered and scarred, hands that had held rifles and made decisions that cost lives and then court-martialed junior officers for following those same orders. She wondered if he was dreaming. She wondered what he would dream about, now that the world had shifted and he lay unconscious while the woman he'd buried 7 years ago stood breathing the same filtered hospital air. She finished her shift at dawn. By Wednesday, the break room ritual had solidified into something ugly and predictable. Margaret entered at 0330 with her lunch, a sandwich wrapped in plastic, a thermos of coffee cooled to room temperature, an apple from the vending machine. The 2 medtechs and a nurse she'd seen 3 times a week for 2 years were standing near the refrigerator. When they saw her in the doorway, something shifted. Not audibly. Not with words. Just a collective decision made in the space of a millisecond, a social frequency only animals could hear. They gathered their food, plastic containers, half-empty yogurts, the casual debris of someone who planned to eat elsewhere, and they left. All of them. Within 10 seconds the break room was vacant except for Margaret and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. She sat at the scarred plastic table where she'd eaten lunch 306 times over the past 3 years. She unwrapped her sandwich. She ate it methodically, chewing each bite the prescribed number of times, drinking her coffee in measured sips. Her face remained blank as a soldier on funeral detail. The lights buzzed their 240 Hz frequency above her head, making the space feel less like a break room and more like an interrogation cell. She was getting good at those. No one returned for the rest of her shift. The break room became her private Antarctica. Friday morning, Margaret arrived at Sacred Heart to find her name posted on the unit disciplinary board outside the nurses' station. The notice was printed on official letterhead, dated and signed by Dr. Caldwell himself, Margaret Walsh, unauthorized access to restricted patient medical files. Violation of HIPAA protocol. Disciplinary investigation pending. She'd been verifying medication allergies. That was all. Standard pre-shift protocol for the ICU. But Caldwell had been watching, waiting, collecting ammunition. He turned her competence into a weapon and discharged it in writing, in triplicate, with institutional weight behind every letter. The notice was laminated. Permanent. An official record that she'd broken protocol, that she couldn't be trusted, that she was the kind of person who accessed files she shouldn't touch. Which was absurd. She'd accessed files she absolutely needed to touch. She'd seen the classification codes that matched the operation at Bagram, the ones that should have been incinerated years ago. She'd seen her own name written in the margins of Colonel Haines's medical summary, the word Valkyrie in handwriting that looked like it belonged to a man confirming something to himself. She'd seen exactly what Caldwell didn't want her to see, and now he was making sure everyone knew she'd looked. The morning shift staff circled that board like it was a fresh kill. They read it. They looked at her. They looked away. By noon, Sacred Heart's grapevine had transformed unauthorized file access into snooping through private medical records and then into stealing information about patients. The story grew teeth. The story began to bite. Around 1600, Margaret was stocking supplies in the storage closet near the medication bay when Nurse Patterson walked past. Patterson had been civil once. They'd worked 12-hour overlaps without incident. Patterson had borrowed Margaret's trauma shears once and returned them without comment. But civil and loyal weren't the same thing, and when institutional wind shifted, civil people learned to blow with it. Patterson didn't break stride. She said over her shoulder, casual as mentioning the weather, "Maybe you should find work elsewhere, Walsh. Nobody wants you here." The words were thrown backward like garbage, not even offered to Margaret's face. Margaret set down the 4-starter pack she was holding with deliberate care. She looked at Patterson's retreating back, already moving away, already committed to the exit, already knowing what was coming. Margaret's hand rose to her coffee cup on the shelving unit, and she picked it up with the same measured precision she'd used to disarm ordnance. She wiped another tear away without breaking eye contact, though Patterson had already turned the corner and couldn't see her anyway. But Margaret spoke anyway. Her voice carried down the corridor with the kind of acoustic precision that came from having shouted orders over rotor wash and small arms fire. It was calm as glass. It was quiet as a knife entering soft tissue. It held no anger because anger required hope that the person hearing it might understand. "I've been dismissed by better than you." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Patterson's footsteps quickened around the corner, and the hospital returned to its ordinary rhythm, monitors beeping, ventilators hissing, wheels squeaking on linoleum, the orchestrated chaos of 200 people trying not to think about how many of them would die before the year ended. Margaret finished her shift. She clocked out at 2100. She drove home in the rain and sat in her parked car in the garage of her apartment complex for 10 minutes without turning the engine off, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles went white. The faded unit patch of the 3rd Special Forces Group was sewn inside her jacket lining, positioned directly over her ribs that had healed wrong after Bagram, that ached when the barometric pressure dropped, that reminded her every single day that some things break and never quite fit back together the way they were supposed to. She couldn't surface. Couldn't defend herself. Couldn't tell anyone that Caldwell was the one violating protocol, that the medical files he'd accused her of accessing were themselves a violation of proper handling procedure, that classified information was supposed to be destroyed, not stored in patient bedside cabinets where anyone with credentials could find it. Major Margaret Walsh had died 7 years ago in a training accident at Fort Bragg. Her decorations were sealed in a vault at the Pentagon. Her service record was redacted to the point of non-existence. She was a ghost in official paperwork and a liability to everyone who'd ordered Bagram buried. She was nothing. And monsters ate nothing for breakfast. Monday afternoon arrived with the weight of inevitability. Dr. Caldwell's office was exactly as Margaret expected, mahogany desk, leather chairs, the kind of furniture that screamed of decisions made from above rather than beside. He didn't invite her to sit. "Your reassignment is effective immediately," Caldwell said, sliding a printed schedule across the desk without meeting her eyes. "Rotating units. No permanent assignment. No patient continuity." Margaret read the paper. Pediatrics Tuesday. Orthopedics Wednesday. Emergency Department Thursday. Maternity on Friday. Every rotation designed to keep her moving, untethered, invisible in a different way than before. This wasn't protection. This was exile in motion. "I understand, Doctor," she said. "Good." He turned to his computer, already dismissing her. "You're dismissed." She was halfway to the door when his voice stopped her. "Not dismissal. Command. Margaret. You understand why this is necessary." She didn't turn around. "Yes, sir." The door closed behind her with a soft click that felt like a lock engaging. By Monday evening, Caldwell made his first call to board member Patricia Sung, the hospital's chief of compliance. "We have a staffing situation in the ICU," he said, his voice carrying the smooth certainty of someone accustomed to being believed. "An employee accessed classified patient files without authorization. I'm implementing a corrective action plan, but I wanted you aware before any formal grievance arrives." He paused, letting the implication settle. "I'm handling it carefully. No need to escalate to HR unless she pushes back." Patricia Sung didn't need more than that. She made a note in her file. Call ended. Tuesday morning, Caldwell called board member James Hartford, the hospital's legal counsel. "Just a heads up," Caldwell said, his tone conversational, almost concerned. "We may have a HIPAA violation to report. An employee, Margaret Walsh, accessed restricted files on a patient she had no clinical reason to review. I'm containing the situation, but you should know it's possible federal agencies will need to be notified." He let that word hang, federal. "I'm documenting everything meticulously." James Hartford, who had spent 20 years protecting the hospital from liability, immediately began building a paper trail that would make Margaret's employment untenable if the hospital needed separation. Call ended. Wednesday, Caldwell called board member David Chen, the hospital's chief financial officer. "That nurse I mentioned," Caldwell said. "Margaret Walsh. She's going to be expensive to keep. We've documented the file access, the behavioral concerns, the pattern of insubordination. If we need to let her go, the separation will be clean. But I wanted you to understand the financial exposure she represents." Translation: her departure would save the hospital from lawsuits. Call ended. Thursday afternoon, Caldwell called ICU charge nurse Rebecca Teo. "No changes to Colonel Haines's care plan without my direct approval," he said, his voice dropping to the tone that meant something was being decided above everyone's head. "I'm managing this case personally. Document everything I order and nothing I don't." Rebecca Teo had worked under Caldwell for 6 years. She knew that tone meant he was protecting something. She knew not to ask questions. "Understood, Doctor." The call ended. The trap was set. Margaret's supervisor, Daniel Reeves, arrived at his office Friday morning to find an email from HR with a subject line that made his stomach drop: confidential, departmental restructuring. Caldwell had already called him on Thursday evening, a courtesy warning that the department was being reorganized and that Reeves would be reassigned to the evening shift, effectively removing him from Margaret's direct oversight. Caldwell had been careful to frame it as an opportunity. "I think you'd be perfect for the evening team. More autonomy. Better growth trajectory." What it actually meant was that Margaret would have no allies in the chain of command. By Friday afternoon, Margaret's hospital access badge had been reprogrammed. She could swipe it and enter the basement levels, the laundry facilities, the mechanical rooms where pipes dripped condensation like a heartbeat counting down to nothing. She could not access any patient care floors. The ICU was now physically sealed to her by a piece of plastic and a database entry. The final shift assignment arrived in her email at 18:47 hours on Friday night, laundry services. Effective immediately. Saturday morning, 0600 hours. Indefinite duration. Saturday morning arrived grey and cold. Margaret walked into the industrial laundry facility at 0559, her shoes echoing on concrete that smelled of bleach and something darker, the chemical ghost of bodily fluids washed away. The facility was a cavern of stainless steel and humidity. Industrial washers hummed in pairs, their drum doors the size of a small child's face. Dryers rumbled like distant thunder. The air hung thick with steam and the smell of detergent, a synthetic floral scent that tried to mask everything underneath and succeeded at nothing. Her supervisor was a woman named Patricia, mid-50s, who had worked laundry for 18 years and had learned not to ask questions when hospital administration moved people around. "You're on the soiled linens cart," Patricia said, gesturing to a rolling bin the size of a refrigerator. "Separate by type. Whites through machine 2. Reds through machine 1. Scrubs go to machine 3, hot water, bleach cycle. Sheets and blankets go to machine 4. Folding station is there." She pointed to a long table with industrial ironing equipment along one wall. "Clock in. Take your breaks. Don't touch anything in the hazmat bin." "Understood," Margaret said. "You used to work upstairs?" Patricia asked, not looking at her directly. "ICU," Margaret said. Patricia nodded, understanding without needing explanation that something had happened. In a hospital, people either moved up or they moved down. Nobody got moved down unless something broke. "Well, welcome to the basement." Margaret started with the soiled linen cart. Scrub stained with blood and antiseptic. Gowns that had touched infected wounds. Sheets that still held the warmth of bodies in crisis. She sorted with mechanical precision, hands moving through motions that required no thought. Her fingers were calloused from field work that happened 7 years ago, work that was officially never her job. The industrial washers cycled through their programs, each one a separate pocket of noise in the cavernous basement. One machine would finish its spin cycle and bang rhythmically as it ejected water. Another would begin its fill with a sound like a river opening a dam. The dryers tumbled in a rhythm that became almost meditative if you stopped fighting it and just let the sound take you somewhere else. By 0900 hours, Margaret was at the folding station. The scrubs came out of the dryer still warm, carrying the smell of laundry chemicals baked into the fabric. She folded them in quarters, muscle memory creating perfect rectangles. Stack them. Next scrub. Fold. Stack. The rhythm became her entire world. At 1000 hours, she unfolded her jacket to retrieve the water bottle she'd brought, and her fingers brushed against the fabric of the inside lining. The faded patch was there, a 3rd Special Forces group, the unit insignia barely visible anymore from 7 years of being pressed against her ribs. She'd sewn it there the day the Pentagon erased her service record, her name removed from official rolls, her decoration sealed in a classified file that no one in this hospital would ever see. The patch was a ghost. A memory of someone who no longer officially existed. She ran her thumb across the embroidery, feeling the threads that were coming loose at the edges. 11 hours holding Bagram airfield with a fractured spine. 2 silver stars given in a ceremony that never officially happened. A Distinguished Service Cross locked in a safe deposit box she'd opened twice since 2017. Upstairs, at 1345 hours, Dr. Caldwell stood in the ICU reviewing Colonel Marcus Haines's chart. The vital sign showed a subtle trend, blood pressure trending downward, heart rate creeping up. Nothing critical yet. Nothing that would alarm an untrained eye. But Caldwell had seen enough charts to know the pattern was beginning. Sepsis, possibly. Infection from an internal site. Or simply the body beginning its slow surrender. He ordered a fluid bolus and no more. When the resident, Dr. Amora Chen, consulted on the case and suggested elevated lactate might indicate escalating shock, Caldwell reviewed the blood work himself and then made a decision that he documented carefully. Current protocols are sufficient. No additional interventions at this time. Document my clinical judgment. Chen wanted to argue. Instead, she documented. At 1,600 hours, Amanda Haines, the colonel's daughter and a Navy lieutenant, arrived for her afternoon visit. She noticed her father's breathing seemed heavier, his rest more fitful. When she asked the charge nurse if something had changed, Rebecca Teo, working under direct orders, said reassuringly, "He's stable. Dr. Caldwell is managing his care personally. Everything is on track." Amanda believed it. Chain of command meant something to her. Officers didn't lie about patient care. At 2,000 hours, the afternoon shift ended and night shift staff took over. Margaret was still in the laundry facility, folding her final batch of scrubs for her final shift. The stack was diminishing. Soon the cart would be empty. At 2,145 hours, upstairs, Colonel Haines's blood pressure dropped to 92/58. His heart rate climbed to 118. The night resident, Dr. Khalil Moshe, looked at the numbers and felt the first spike of concern. He reached for the phone to call Caldwell, standard protocol when vitals began deteriorating, but Caldwell answered before the first ring completed. "I'm already here," Caldwell said. "Reviewing the chart now. Current protocols remain in effect. Continue monitoring. Document every reading." Moshe wanted to escalate. Protocol said to escalate. Instead, he documented and watched the screen. At 2,300 hours, Margaret finished her final fold. The last scrub went onto the stack. The laundry cart was empty, its interior clean and gleaming under the industrial lights. She removed her name tag and clocked out, the machine beeping her exit into the record books. Then she climbed the stairs to leave through the basement exit, toward the parking garage. Her hospital access badge wouldn't open the ICU elevator. It wouldn't let her onto any patient care floor. The plastic card in her pocket was now a symbol of everything the hospital had decided she was: temporary, untethered, untrustworthy. She sat in her car in the parking garage, jacket in her lap. Her fingers found the patch again, that faded 3rd Special Forces Group insignia pressed against her ribs like a heartbeat only she could feel. 7 years of invisibility. 3 years of nursing shifts where nobody knew her name. And now, reassignment to a basement where even invisibility was too visible. The fluorescent lights of the parking garage hummed above her, their yellow-white glow making everything look like it was already disappearing. 0247 hours. The basement laundry room hummed its mechanical lullaby, washers and dryers cycling through the small hours when nobody counted the work that kept the hospital running. Margaret stood at the folding table, her forgotten water bottle in her hand, the plastic still cold from hours in the break room freezer. She'd come back for it without thinking, muscle memory pulling her down the back stairs even though her final shift had ended at midnight. Even though Dr. Caldwell's termination papers sat in her locker upstairs, signed and dated and final as a closed casket. The basement smelled like bleach and heat and the peculiar staleness of a place underground. She unscrewed the cap, took a drink. The water was clean. Everything here was clean, except the work itself, the work of erasing people, starting with their names on the schedule, ending with their names on the firing paperwork. She set the bottle down on the folding table beside a stack of sheets that would go back upstairs tomorrow, back to rooms where people healed or didn't, where no one asked the names of those who washed the blood away. That was when the overhead speakers crackled. The sound cut through the dryer noise like a blade. Code Blue, ICU room for 12. Code Blue, ICU room for 12. Margaret's hand froze halfway to her side. Room for 12. The room number lived in her chest like shrapnel. Colonel Marcus Haines. The man whose voice had sentenced her in a classified hearing she wasn't allowed to acknowledge. The man lying upstairs in a hospital bed, his vital signs monitored by machines that didn't know what machine she'd carried under fire in Bagram. The man whose file she'd seen 3 days ago, the classified treatment codes swimming before her eyes like accusations. The second announcement came. ICU room for 12. Code Blue. ETA surgical team 2 minutes. Margaret's bottle rolled across the folding table. It fell. She was already moving. The stairs took her lungs first. She'd been a night shift nurse for 3 years in this hospital, invisible, precise, walking these corridors like a ghost paid hourly wages. Now she climbed the utility stairwell 3 steps at a time, her badge pulling against her scrub pocket. The upper levels came fast. 2nd floor. 3rd floor. The ICU corridor should have been locked, always locked, access badge only, but the security door stood propped open, a janitor, maybe, or someone transporting equipment. She didn't ask. She'd learned long ago that the people nobody sees can move through spaces everyone else has sealed. Room for 12 was chaos in motion. The monitor screamed its arrhythmia. Chest compressions already in progress, a resident pumping, someone calling out pressures that dropped with each second, 88/52 and falling. 82/48. Lost pressure on that last pump. Blood pooled at the sheet line. Post-surgical complication. Internal hemorrhage. The night shift had only 2 nurses assigned to ICU, and they were both here, and they were drowning. Colonel Haines lay grey-skinned and leaking, the surgical site reopened from inside where nobody could see it until it was too late. His chest wasn't just wounded, the pressure was building, pooling blood compressing his lungs, his heart, the structures that still wanted to keep him alive despite everything trying to stop them. Margaret saw it all in 2 seconds. The panic on the resident's face. The nurse at the head of the bed fumbling with the oxygen line. The visitor chair where someone had left an MRE, a meal ready to eat, tan-colored packaging, the kind veterans carried like memories. It lay on the chair seat, wrapper half open, the plastic interior still visible. Her hands moved before her brain asked permission. She crossed the room in 3 strides. Nobody stopped her. In moments like this, she looked like she belonged. In moments like this, looking like you belonged was the only credential that mattered. She grabbed the MRE wrapper, assessed it even as she was moving, plastic composition, structural integrity, adhesive potential. In Bagram, she'd sealed sucking chest wounds with whatever was available, helmet liners, poncho material, body armor carriers, once a fighter pilot's ejection seat cushion and medical tape stripped from a dead medic's aid bag. The MRE wrapper was better than any of that. Pressures collapsing, the resident gasped. I can't get adequate compressions. The whole left side is. Stop, Margaret said. The resident kept pumping. Stop compressions. Now. Something in her voice, the weight of it, the way it sat in the air like a command that had already been obeyed in 6 different conflicts, made him stop. The monitor showed the flat line creeping worse, but she was already moving, already positioning her left hand on Haines's chest, feeling for the space between his ribs, finding the wound site where internal bleeding was suffocating him as surely as a rope. She tore the MRE packaging into a seal, positioned it over the site, her finger steady as a surgical laser. The plastic adhered to his sweat-soaked skin. She ran her palm over it, testing pressure, distributing weight, the way she'd learned from a sergeant named Holloway in 2014 when their phi base got hit and everyone who could hold a rifle had to hold a patient instead. Push 1 of epi, she said. The resident didn't ask who she was or why she was giving orders in a voice that belonged to someone who'd given them before. He pushed the epinephrine into the central line. Compressions resume. Slower. Deeper. You're working against pressure now, not trying to restart his heart. He's got oxygenation. You're moving that oxygen until his heart remembers how. She placed her hand over the MRE seal, monitoring pressure, controlling bleeding through applied weight and physics that didn't need her name or credentials or the official erasure that followed her like a shadow. 30 seconds. The monitor response was incremental. Sinus rhythm flickered at the edges of the flat line. Weak, but present. The oxygen sat reading climbed, 68. 72, 76. Her hand stayed on the seal, her eyes on his face, waiting for the moment when he was stable enough to move, when the code team arrived from surgery and she could step back and disappear again. The next voice she heard was clipped and professional, code team coming through, move left, surgical nurses entered with the kind of purposeful speed that meant they'd done this before. They didn't acknowledge her. They didn't need to. She removed her hand, stepped back, her part of the emergency over. The seal held. The bleeding controlled. The rhythm climbing. O2 sat 79 and rising. 0251 for minutes from the initial call. Colonel Marcus Haines still had a pulse. That was when she saw Dr. Caldwell in the doorway, watching her. His eyes were fixed on her hands, the same hands that had just performed field medicine with the precision of someone trained by the United States Army, someone who'd held soldiers together with improvisation and presence and knowledge that civilian medical school could never teach. His expression didn't change. But something shifted in his face, a recalculation, a recognition of something he'd been suspecting and now confirmed. She moved toward the door, toward the corridor, toward the small remaining invisibility she had left. But Caldwell didn't step aside. For a moment they stood 3 feet apart, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects caught in amber. "Laundry services," he said quietly. Not a question. A statement. An accusation made polite by his presence. She didn't answer. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't make things worse. She was already fired. She was already erased. What remained was the paperwork, the formal process, the machinery of institutions grinding through the steps of making people disappear. She walked past him. The corridor was empty except for night nurses who knew better than to ask questions. 0600 hours. 6 hours later. Margaret stood in the basement laundry room for what would be the last time. Dr. Caldwell had delivered her termination papers himself, his voice professionally detached, unauthorized floor access. Unauthorized patient contact. Effective immediately. Security will escort you to retrieve your personal items and process your exit. The escort had waited outside the staff room while she cleaned out her locker. No one offered apologies. No one met her eyes. The rumor would already be starting. The invisible nurse had violated protocols, had been caught in places she wasn't authorized to be, had finally proven that whatever strange distance she maintained from the rest of the staff wasn't professionalism at all but insubordination dressed up in quiet competence. Now she stood in this low-ceilinged room with its industrial washers and the smell of bleach and heat, and she folded her scrubs one final time. Each fold exact. Each movement deliberate. The scrubs were hospital property. She folded them and stacked them in the designated bin. Her jacket hung on the hook where she'd left it when she arrived for the shift that had ended 13 hours ago, back when she was still just a nurse, before she'd stopped compressions and improvised a seal and let someone see the hands beneath the uniform. She reached for the jacket. The patch was still there, sewn into the lining the way she'd done it years ago, 3rd Special Forces Group, faded olive drab, a ghost of an identity that had been legally erased before she was erased from this basement. The stitching was precise. The patch was invisible unless you knew to look for it. Unless you were inside the jacket, close enough to feel the weight of something that didn't officially exist. She put on the jacket. She didn't take it off. The basement door locked behind her with a sound like finality. The parking garage stretched empty, fluorescent yellow-white, the light making everything look diminished. Her car was parked in the spot she'd used for 3 years, never closer to the entrance, never taking the good spaces, never drawing attention even in the mechanics of parking. She sat in the driver's seat, hands on the steering wheel, her breath the only sound in the small metal box of the car. Outside, Raleigh was waking up. Sunday morning. The hospital was cycling through its weekend rhythms above her, surgeons examining post-op patients, residents reading charts, nurses charting vitals. In room for 12, Colonel Marcus Haines would be recovering from a code that he wouldn't remember, sustained by blood transfusions and the intervention of a woman he'd court-martialed 7 years ago, a woman he would never know had saved him because she was already gone. She pulled out of the parking space and drove toward whatever came next. 3 days. That's how long it took for Colonel Marcus Haines to wake up. The hospital hummed its familiar rhythm, monitors beeping in measured intervals, ventilators wheeling their mechanical breath, the soft percussion of feet on tile echoing through corridors that Margaret no longer walked. She existed in the basement now, in the industrial laundry room where steam rose from pressurized washers and the smell of bleach burned the back of her throat like diesel exhaust. The fluorescent lights down here didn't hum so much as scream, a high-pitched frequency that made her teeth ache. She didn't mind. The noise was better than silence. Silence meant thinking. Dr. Caldwell had been efficient. The termination papers were waiting in her locker by 0600 Monday morning, cold and clinical, signed by the hospital administrator with a notation about misconduct and unauthorized file access and a violation of patient privacy protocols. 4 pages of bureaucratic language designed to make her look like a liability. She'd read them once, folded them in thirds, and placed them in a manila envelope she never opened again. What struck her wasn't the words, she'd survived court-martials, erasure, 7 years of invisibility. It was the speed. Caldwell had moved through the hospital's power structure like a knife through silk. 2 phone calls Monday morning to board members. 1 reassignment order that stripped her supervisor of any authority to contest her placement. 1 revised access badge that reduced her to basement-level clearance, a non-person in the building she'd worked. But she'd stabilized Haines. And somebody had kept the footage. That Tuesday afternoon, Captain James Rodriguez walked into Sacred Heart Hospital wearing civilian clothes and a weathered expression that had been forged in places maps didn't show. He was there to visit a wounded brother-in-arms, a 75th Ranger recovering from orthopedic surgery. But before he saw that patient, he stopped cold in the ICU hallway outside room for 12. Because something in the security footage from the Code Blue had caught the attention of the Veterans Network, had moved through channels with the speed of classified briefings, had reached enough eyes that when Rodriguez heard the description, night shift nurse, field medicine, chest seal from an MRE wrapper, commands that sounded like they came from a commission, he requested the footage himself. He watched it on a tablet in the ICU break room at 1345 hours Tuesday. 7 minutes of video. By minute 4, his hands were shaking. Colonel Haines opened his eyes at 0622 Wednesday morning, 3 days after his heart stopped beating. The ventilator was already coming out, his breathing spontaneous enough, his pupils reactive. Dr. Caldwell wasn't in the room when consciousness returned. It was a resident, Dr. Patel, who noted the time and called for the attending. Within an hour, Haines was asking questions. His daughter Amanda was there, Lieutenant Amanda Haines, U.S. Navy, Medical Corps, and she sat at the bedside while her father's voice came back rough and thin. "The night nurse," he said. "Someone pulled me back." Someone's hands, his daughter leaned forward. "That was 3 days ago, Dad." "You coded." Someone intervened. "I need to see the footage." It wasn't a request. It was a command, spoken in the measured tone of a man who had moved mountains with such words. The footage arrived within 2 hours. It was flagged in the hospital system, meaning Caldwell saw it being accessed. Patel played the 7 minutes on the monitor at the foot of the bed. Amanda watched her father's face as he watched the video. She saw the moment recognition hit him like a percussion round. His body went still. His breath caught. "Valkyrie," he whispered. That word hung in the air of room for 12 like radiation. It was a call sign. It was memory. It was a woman's name that had been removed from 7 years of official records, deleted from unit rosters, scrubbed from every database that mattered. Haines's hand gripped the bed rail with white knuckles, and his daughter saw tears moving down his face, silent, unstoppable tears of a man who had just realized he'd been alive because of someone he'd tried to destroy. "That woman is a major." Amanda's voice was steady, military-trained composure, but her hands were moving. Already moving. She was out of the room in seconds, down to the ICU nursing station where 3 nurses were charting. "I need Margaret Walsh's personnel file. Full record. Now." The authority in her tone left no room for bureaucratic questions. A file appeared. Hands trembled as they opened it, decades of muscle memory serving officers, serving certainty. One nurse, a woman named Sarah Chen, read the redacted service number aloud. It was the same number typed into Colonel Haines's classified unit records. The same designation. The same person. "She saved him," Chen whispered. By 14:30 Wednesday afternoon, Captain Rodriguez was sitting in Dr. Caldwell's office. He'd requested the meeting formally, through channels, with a politeness that was technically correct but carried the weight of something else entirely. Caldwell sat behind his desk with the confidence of a man who controlled his environment, who had successfully isolated a threat, who believed that control was his superpower. Rodriguez sat across from him in civilian clothes, but everything about his posture screamed combat veteran. Everything about his eye screamed recognition. Everything about his next words made Caldwell's face go pale. "I saw the footage, Dr. Caldwell. That woman in room for 12 during the Code Blue. I know her from a joint operation briefing in 2017. Rodriguez's voice was level, conversational, the tone of a man discussing weather. "That's the officer who held Bagram airfield for 11 hours with a fractured spine. Field medicine on 3 casualties while taking incoming. Bronze Star favela." Rodriguez paused. The silence was the silence of a predator who had just shown its teeth. 2 silver stars. And a Distinguished Service Cross. Caldwell's jaw worked. No words came. Rodriguez stood, collected his tablet, and walked to the door. Before he left, he turned back. The thing about erasing someone's record is, other people remember. And we talk. Among ourselves. By 1800 hours Wednesday, Dr. Caldwell's office was no longer his office. By 1900 hours, 2 FBI agents were waiting in a conference room on the administrative level, and James Torres, the hospital IT director, a former Marine who'd served in information security, was providing them with documentation. Timestamps. File access logs. For deletion attempts on the security footage from Sunday morning's Code Blue. All failed. All logged. Torres had moved the footage to external servers the moment he saw Caldwell trying to access the security database, had flagged it to federal authorities before Caldwell even finished his first attempt. He tried to destroy evidence of a federally protected identity, Torres said quietly, sliding a folder across the table to the FBI agents. "I preserved everything. The attempts. The communications. Everything." The agents nodded. They'd been expecting something like this. Colonel Haines had already made a statement from his hospital bed. Amanda Haines had already contacted military legal counsel. And the Bagram operation, 7 years buried, 7 years sealed, was going to be very interesting to certain people at the Pentagon. By Thursday morning, the hospital's board convened an emergency session. By Friday, Caldwell's medical license was suspended pending investigation. Federal charges were coming. The hospital offered him the option to resign quietly. He refused, believing he had grounds to fight. By Monday, after federal investigators found the digital trail, his audit of Margaret's file 2 weeks prior, his attempts to research the Bagram connection, his discovery of the sealed operation classification and Haines's restricted designation, his attorney advised him that fighting was no longer an option. He accepted the termination. The news spread through Sacred Heart by Tuesday. By Wednesday, the story was in the Raleigh medical community networks. By Thursday, it was on regional news. Decorated war hero revealed after 7 years. Hospital executive faces federal charges for obstruction. The veterans community had already known. But now everyone else did too. Margaret Walsh didn't watch the news. She didn't check hospital networks. She simply finished her shifts in the basement, folded the last stack of clean scrubs, and submitted her resignation letter to match the termination they'd already issued. Professional courtesy. She would leave Sacred Heart cleanly. She would disappear again, different this time, not erased, just gone by choice. That was until Colonel Haines made his second phone call. 6 months later, on a Tuesday evening in late spring, Margaret Walsh walked through the main entrance of Sacred Heart Hospital in civilian clothes. Jeans. A button-down shirt. The jacket with the faded unit patch still sewn inside its lining, the 3rd Special Forces group symbol pressed against her ribs like a heartbeat only she could feel. She'd spent the last 180 days processing her discharge, waiting for paperwork, and letting federal investigators close the loop on the Bagram operation. Her service record was being restored. Her decorations would be returned. None of it would be public, the Bagram mission would remain classified, but the people who mattered would know. The men and women who'd served with her would know. Colonel Haines was in rehabilitation. 3 times a week, therapy for the cardiac weakness that had almost killed him. Margaret had received a letter, handwritten, asking her to visit. No demands, no commands, just an invitation from a man who'd spent 6 months understanding what it meant to have your life saved twice by the same woman. She walked past the security desk in the lobby. The man sitting there was wearing an ill-fitting night security uniform, his face gaunt, his eyes moving from the monitor screens in front of him. Dr. Caldwell. His medical license had been suspended. Federal charges had been reduced to misdemeanors in a quiet plea deal. His professional life was finished. This was the only work he could find, minimum wage, overnight shifts, watching hallways he'd once ruled through a series of security cameras that showed him everything except anything that mattered anymore. He looked up. Recognition flickered across his face. Margaret paused at his desk, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since the morning she'd left the hospital as a nurse. She didn't speak. She simply nodded once, not a greeting, not a farewell, just acknowledgement of where they both stood now. Then she walked past, toward the elevators, toward the 4th floor, toward the man waiting for her. Colonel Haines stood when she entered the rehabilitation lounge. His movements were careful, still showing the weakness of the cardiac event, but his posture was straight. His hand rose in a salute. Margaret returned it instinctively, muscle memory that had never left her hands. "Major," he said clearly. The rank hung in the air between them like everything that had been hidden, now visible. "They Saturday." Amanda Haines was there, listening to her father and this woman discuss 7 years of erased history, the court-martial that had never officially existed, the Bagram operation that had cost them both everything and given them both a reason to keep moving forward. They talked until visiting hours ended. As Margaret stood to leave, Colonel Haines called after her. "You saved my life twice. Once at Bagram. Once here." Margaret turned at the doorway. The jacket was still there, holding the patch, holding the weight of everything she'd carried. She met his eyes one final time. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. She descended to the lobby, walked past Caldwell's security desk without looking, and stepped out into Raleigh's evening air. The patch inside her jacket pressed against her ribs, no longer a ghost, finally a memory she could carry in daylight. If you found yourself invested in Margaret's story, please like this video and subscribe for more tales of hidden heroes and unexpected justice. What would you have done in her position? Let us know in the comments below.